He didn't ask her to leave. He made her disappear. In front of 500 witnesses, every Don, every captain, every blood-soaked name that mattered in the New York underworld, Cassian Vescari reached across the table, took his wife's hand, and pulled the ring from her finger like he was removing a splinter. No raised voice, no hesitation, just the cold, quiet certainty of a man who had already decided. "Get her out," he said. And just like that, Serena Vale ceased to exist inside the walls her loyalty had built. If you've ever been erased by someone you gave everything to, you already know what happened next. Stay with this story. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Like if you believe the wrong person always pays first, because they do. And this time, the price was going to be catastrophic. Check him. The Meridian Hotel Ballroom had been rented under a shell company registered in Delaware, its true purpose invisible to every city agency that might have cared. 3 chandeliers hung overhead, each one burning with enough wattage to make the crystal throw light like scattered glass across the faces below. 5 long tables had been arranged in a pentagon, one for each family. And at the center, a single round table held nothing but a bottle of Barolo, 5 empty glasses, and a leather document case containing the peace agreement that had taken Cassian Vescari 11 months to architect. He had called it a treaty. His captains called it a miracle. The men seated around those tables had spent 40 years trying to kill each other. Tonight, they were going to sign their names next to each other's. That alone was worth the 3 chandeliers, the 200 security personnel distributed across 4 floors, and the fact that Cassian had not slept in 31 hours. He looked at 2. The sleeplessness. His collar was open 1 button lower than his habit. His jaw carried 2 days of growth he hadn't bothered to address. But his eyes were steady, and the 5 Dons watching him from their respective tables read that steadiness, the way their kind always read such things, as a form of warning. Serena stood near the eastern wall, not at his side, not at a table. She had positioned herself where she always positioned herself at these events, visible enough to be noticed, close enough to move if something shifted, far enough away that no one could read her as Cassian's shadow. She wore a dark burgundy dress, no jewelry except the ring, the Vescari ring, a flat-faced emerald set in oxidized silver that his grandmother had worn until her hands could no longer hold its weight. It was not a beautiful piece. It was a piece that meant something. She was watching Aldo Ferrante. Aldo Ferrante, patriarch of the Ferrante family, 71 years old, who had buried 2 sons and 1 nephew in the last decade of interfamily violence, sat at his table with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes aimed at Cassian with an expression Serena recognized. She had seen it before. That specific arrangement of stillness that meant a man was deciding something, not whether to sign, something else. She caught the eye of Ferrante's eldest surviving son across the room, a narrow man named Gio, who had the unfortunate quality of showing everything on his face. Gio glanced at his father, then at the door behind the dais, then at his watch. Serena moved. She crossed the room without rushing, stopped at the small staging table near the dais, poured water into a glass she didn't need, and angled herself so that she could see the service corridor that ran behind the eastern wall. The door at the far end was ajar. Through it, she could see the jacket of a man who was not hotel staff. Wrong cut, wrong posture, standing with his back to the room. She set the water glass down. She found Cassian's security chief, a former military contractor named Breck, standing 6 feet away with his hands clasped in front of him, and she said without looking at him, "Service corridor east, 1 man, wrong jacket, he's been there 8 minutes." Breck didn't ask how she knew the time. He moved. The man in the service corridor turned out to be a photographer for a wire service that had somehow obtained the building's layout. He was removed quietly, his equipment confiscated, the incident noted and set aside. No one at the 5 tables ever knew it happened. Cassian didn't know it happened. He was at the center table, uncapping the Barolo, saying something to Ferrante's consigliere that made the old man's mouth almost move toward a smile. He had a talent for that, making old men almost smile. It was the same talent that had gotten him into rooms most people never survived long enough to enter, and the same talent that made him believe sometimes that his ability to read a room was absolute. It was not absolute. It had gaps. large ones. And Serena had been quietly filling them for 6 years without his knowledge, which was the only reason he was still alive to pour that wine. The signing took 40 minutes. Ferrante went last, his pen moving with the slow deliberateness of a man who understood that this act was irreversible, that his name on this paper was a kind of death for the version of himself that had spent 4 decades in controlled warfare. When he finished, he set the pen down and looked up at Cassian. "Your father would not have been able to do this," Ferrante said. It was not a compliment to Cassian's father. "No," Cassian agreed. "He wouldn't have." Ferrante picked up his wine glass. The other dons followed. Cassian raised his own. The room followed. Captains, consiglieres, wives placed at distant tables, security personnel momentarily at ease. 500 people lifted their glasses in a room that had never held this particular combination of names without also holding loaded weapons aimed at the exits. Serena lifted hers with everyone else. She watched Cassian's face in the moment the crystal touched his lips. The fraction of a second release, the thing that passed through his eyes when the last obstacle fell. She had seen that look before, too. It was the look of a man who believed the hard part was over. She knew it wasn't. She knew because 3 weeks earlier, a man named Calder Rinn had called her from a blocked number and told her that someone in Cassian's inner circle was feeding information about Vescari operations to the Moretti Syndicate out of Boston, and that whoever was doing it had been careful to construct a trail that pointed at her. She had spent 3 weeks quietly dismantling that trail, pulling strings in places Cassian didn't know she could reach, trading in favors accumulated over years of the kind of quiet, invisible work that built no monuments and left no record. She had not told Cassian, not because she didn't trust him, because she knew him. Knew that if she told him there was a leak pointing at her, he would move immediately, loudly, and in the wrong direction, and the treaty signing, 11 months of work, the most important political achievement of his career, would fracture before the ink dried. So she had handled it. She had handled it the way she handled most things, quietly, carefully, without acknowledgement. The problem was that she had not finished. The trail was dismantled, but the source was not identified. Whoever had constructed it was still in the room, and they were patient. She didn't know how patient until she saw Cassian's face change. It happened between the toast and the dessert course, during the loose, celebratory drift of the room when security had relaxed and conversations had fragmented into smaller clusters. Cassian was speaking with 2 of his senior captains, men named Orsini and Polk, and something one of them said made his posture shift, not visibly, not in a way that most people in the room would have caught. But Serena had spent 9 years reading his body, and she saw it. The small withdrawal, the jaw setting, the eyes going flat in the way they went flat when he was deciding something he'd already decided. She started moving toward him. She was 12 feet away when he turned and looked at her directly, and she knew immediately from the quality of that look that she was too late. He crossed the room toward her, and the dons nearby, attuned to the gravity of him, went quiet in a spreading ring, the way water goes quiet around a stone dropped in it. "Serena." His voice was completely level. That was the worst sign. "Cassian." The call to Moretti, February 14th, 47 minutes. She felt the floor change under her, not physically. A perceptual shift, the kind that comes when something you expected to survive suddenly becomes something you won't. "That call wasn't mine. I've been tracing who—" "Calder Rinn," he said. "A man who works for the Moretti Syndicate. You've spoken to him 3 times in the last month." The room was listening now, not ostentatiously. These were men trained to appear inattentive while absorbing everything, but listening. She could feel it. All 500 people in that room, recalibrating. "I've been tracking a leak," she said, keeping her voice as level as she could manage, which was very level, because she had been keeping her voice level in bad rooms for most of her adult life. "Someone in your operation built a trail to make it look like I was the source. I've been dismantling it. Rinn is—" "You've been negotiating with Moretti's man," Cassian said, "behind my back. During a treaty signing I've spent a year building. That is not what— in front of everyone here tonight." He turned slightly, just enough to let the room know he intended to be heard. My wife has been communicating with a Boston syndicate while I sat across the table from the men they were planning to use against us. The silence that followed was of a particular texture, not shocked exactly. These were not men who shocked easily. It was more like the silence of people watching an avalanche, absorbed by the scale of it. Serena looked at him. She looked at him for what felt like a long time, long enough to count the things passing across his face. Certainty, anger, something underneath both of those that she might have called grief if she thought he was capable of feeling it in this moment. He wasn't. The certainty had sealed everything over. She had one move left, and it was a bad one. She could say the name of the person who had actually built the trail, the person she was 90% sure of but could not yet prove. If she said it now, without proof, in this room, she would be attacking a member of his inner circle at the peace signing, and it would look exactly like what it was designed to look like, a cornered woman throwing accusations. She didn't say the name. "You are wrong," she said instead, quietly, precisely. "And you know me well enough to know I wouldn't do this." He looked at her for a moment. Just a moment. Then he reached across and took her hand. The gesture was so familiar, he had taken her hand 1,000 times, that her body didn't immediately understand what was happening. What was happening was that he was removing the ring. The flat-faced emerald, the oxidized silver, his grandmother's ring, the one she had worn for 9 years. He held it between his thumb and 2 fingers for a second, looking at it. Then he placed it on the table behind him, next to someone's unfinished wine glass. "Get her out," he said. 2 of his men moved immediately. She didn't struggle. There was no version of struggling that ended well in this room, and she was not a woman who spent herself on gestures that achieved nothing. She walked with the 2 men toward the exit, and she kept her eyes forward, and she did not look back at Cassian. She looked at Ferrante. The old Don was watching her with an expression that was the opposite of the one he'd given Cassian all evening. What she saw on his face was not dismissal. It was not contempt. What she saw was something that looked, if she was reading it right, like the particular sorrow of a man watching something valuable and irreplaceable get broken by someone who didn't understand what he was holding. Ferrante gave a small nod. She held his gaze for one more second, and then the door closed behind her. She stood in the hallway outside the ballroom for exactly as long as it took to retrieve her coat and her phone from the coat check. The coat check attendant was a young woman who had the good sense not to ask anything. Serena tipped her twice what the coat was worth. In the elevator, she allowed herself 30 seconds. 30 seconds to feel the full weight of it, the ring, the room, the particular brutality of being erased in public by the one person who should have known better than anyone. 30 seconds of that, because it was real, and it deserved to be felt, and she had never been in the habit of pretending that things didn't hurt when they did. Then the elevator reached the lobby. She walked out into the November air, hailed a cab, and was gone. Within 4 hours, every Dawn at the Meridian Hotel knew that Serena Vale had left the building. Within 6 hours, 3 of them had already made calls she was meant to receive. Within 12 hours, the infrastructure of the Vescari Empire began, very quietly, to come apart at the seams. And Cassian Vescari, standing at the apex of the most significant political achievement of his criminal career, had no idea that the woman he'd just banished was the only reason any of it had been possible in the first place. He would find out. He would find out in the most brutal way available to a man who had spent his life believing that power was something you built, not something you were given by the loyalty of the person standing quietly beside you. But that was coming. For now, the chandeliers were still burning in the Meridian ballroom, and the wine was still good, and Cassian Vescari stood at the center of 5 families who had just signed his name next to theirs. 5 families who were already, in the quiet corners of their minds, revising everything they thought they knew about what had just happened tonight. Not because the treaty had failed, because the man who built it had just made the single worst decision of his life, in front of every witness that mattered, and none of them were going to forget it. The cab took Serena across the bridge into Brooklyn, and she didn't tell the driver where to go until they were halfway across. Old habit, the kind you develop when you've spent enough years in rooms where people track departures. "Sunset Park," she said, "corner of 43rd and 8th. The driver nodded and didn't look at her in the mirror, which was all she needed from him. She sat with her bare left hand in her lap. The finger where the ring had been felt wrong. Not painful, just absent in a way that kept drawing her attention, the way a missing tooth draws the tongue. She stopped looking at it. She looked out the window instead, at the bridge cables sliding past in the dark, at the lights of lower Manhattan receding behind her, at the black water below that held no reflection worth studying. Her phone had 7 missed calls by the time the cab reached Brooklyn. She looked at the names. Ferrante's consigliere, a woman named Dava, who ran the Costello family's legal operation. 2 numbers she didn't recognize, but recognized the area codes of 1 Boston, 1 Philadelphia. A man named Priest who worked independent of every family and answered to no one, which meant he answered to everyone when it suited him. And Breck, Cassian's security chief, whose calls she understood and would not be returning. She returned none of them. Not yet. The cab stopped at the corner she'd named. She paid in cash, got out, and stood on the sidewalk in front of a dry cleaning shop that had been closed for 4 hours. Above the shop was a 2-bedroom apartment registered to a woman named Clara Soto, who did not exist. Serena had maintained the lease for 3 years. She had never told Cassian it existed. She went upstairs. The apartment smelled like dust and the faint chemical trace of the dry cleaning below. She turned on 1 lamp, sat at the small table near the window, and placed her phone face down in front of her. Then she sat with her hands flat on the table and thought carefully, in the specific way she had learned to think. Not about what she felt, not yet, but about what she knew and what needed to happen next. What she knew, the trail had been constructed by someone patient and close, someone who understood the timing of the treaty signing well enough to choose tonight as the moment of detonation. The evidence Cassian had been shown, the call logs, the RIN contacts, had been assembled with enough craft to convince a man who was already, on some level, looking for a reason to believe the worst. Not because he was a fool, because he was exhausted and suspicious in the way that powerful men get suspicious when they've spent too long holding something fragile. She had known he was close to that edge. She had watched it for weeks. She had thought she had more time. She had not had more time. What needed to happen, the source had to be identified and confirmed, not suspected, confirmed, because she understood now that whatever came next was not going to be a quiet correction. She had been removed publicly, deliberately, at the worst possible moment. Whoever had done this wasn't trying to create a temporary problem. They were trying to create a permanent fracture between Cassian and his wife, between the Vescari syndicate and the 4 families who had watched Serena walk out of that room tonight with more dignity than the man who'd sent her. She picked up her phone and called Ferrante's consigliere back. The man's name was Sal. He answered on the first ring, which told her he'd been sitting with the phone in his hand. "Where are you?" he said. "Somewhere quiet. You need to know that Don Ferrante made 3 calls in the car on the way home tonight." "I know who he called." A pause. "Then you know what they're thinking." "They're thinking that Cassian just demonstrated he doesn't understand his own operation." "They're thinking more than that," Sal said. "They're thinking that the one person who has spent 6 years keeping this city from going to war just got thrown out of the building by the man who was supposed to protect her. And now they're wondering what that means for the agreement they just signed." Serena was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck moved down 8th Avenue, its engine loud in the way night engines always are. "Tell Don Ferrante I'm aware of his concern," she said. "Tell him I'm not gone. Tell him that whatever he's thinking about doing in the next 72 hours, he should wait. He's not a patient man. He's the most patient man in that room, and they both know it. That's why he's still alive." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear Sal breathing, deciding how much to say. "There's a name that came up tonight, after you left." "Don't tell me over the phone." "No," he agreed, "not over the phone." She set a time and a location, a diner in Red Hook she'd used before, and ended the call. Then she sat for another minute before opening the phone again and pulling up a number she'd never stored under a real name. It rang 4 times before a man answered with nothing but silence. "It's me," she said. "I heard." The voice was low, careful, unhurried. The voice of a man who made his living in the space between certainties. "I need everything you have on the call architecture from February. The logs Cassian was shown tonight. I need to know who built them and how far back the construction goes." "That's going to take time." "I have some," she said.
Not much. How much? She thought about Ferrante's 3 calls, about the Boston area code, about the fact that ambitious men, when they sense a vacuum, don't wait to see if it fills itself. 72 hours, she said. Maybe less. She ended the call, set the phone down, and finally let herself sit back in the chair. The lamp threw a small circle of yellow light across the table. Beyond it, the apartment was dark and still and completely unknown to anyone who meant her harm. For the first time in 11 months, she had no idea what the next day would bring. She noticed that the feeling was not entirely fear. It was something else, something older and more clarifying, the feeling of a woman who has spent years managing someone else's survival, finally facing a situation that was entirely, unambiguously her own. She didn't sleep for a long time. When she did, she slept without dreaming, which was how she always slept when the situation was serious enough that her mind had already accepted what was coming and decided to save its energy. Cassian Vescari, across the river in the Vescari estate, did not sleep at all. He stood at the window of his study at 3 a.m. with a glass of the same Barolo they had opened at the signing, and he looked out at the grounds below, the lights along the drive, the security rotation he could track by the movement of shadows. And he told himself he'd made the right call. He told himself this several times. The ring was on his desk behind him. He hadn't put it away. He'd carried it home in his jacket pocket and set it on the desk when he walked in, and it had been sitting there for 3 hours while he stood at the window and drank wine he wasn't tasting and did not allow himself to look at it. His phone was full of messages he hadn't read. At 2 a.m, Orsini, one of the captains who'd brought him the information tonight, had sent a message that said simply, "She hasn't surfaced. No contacts, no trail." Cassian had read that one. He'd read it 3 times. No trail. Serena didn't vanish. She was not the kind of woman who vanished. She was the kind of woman who was always precisely, exactly where she intended to be. He drank the last of the wine and set the glass down and finally turned around and looked at the ring. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked away, because there was something in the looking that felt like the beginning of a question he wasn't ready to answer. He went to find Lucien. Lucien Drey, his consigliere, his closest counsel, the man who had been beside him for 15 years, was still awake in the East Wing, as Cassian had known he would be. Lucien was always awake. It was one of the qualities Cassian had always valued in him, that readiness, that sense of a man permanently oriented toward what came next. "The Ferrante consigliere called twice tonight," Cassian said from the doorway. "I know." Lucien looked up from the desk where he was working. His expression was measured, concerned in a way that seemed entirely appropriate to the circumstances. "They're unsettled. Tonight wasn't what they expected." "No," Cassian said. "It wasn't." "You did what you had to do." Cassian said nothing. He looked at Lucien. Really looked. The way he looked at men across tables when he was trying to find the seam in what they were showing him. And Lucien held his gaze evenly, the way he always did. And after a moment, Cassian nodded. "Make sure the captains are where they're supposed to be tomorrow," he said. "All of them." "Of course." Cassian went back to his study. He sat at his desk. He did not look at the ring again. But in the morning, without quite knowing why, the first thing he did was pick it up. The ring sat on the corner of his desk for 3 days before Cassian put it in his drawer. He told himself it was because he hadn't decided what to do with it yet. That was partially true. The fuller truth was that every time he walked into the study, he looked at it first. Before his phone, before the overnight reports, before the coffee his housekeeper left at 7. And that looking was becoming a habit he didn't want to examine too closely. The reports on his desk were harder to ignore. Day 1 after the signing, 2 wire transfers from the Vescari operating account in the Caymans had been frozen by the receiving bank in Luxembourg, citing a regulatory review. The Vescari legal team said it was routine. Cassian's financial man, a meticulous accountant named Ferris, who had never once used the word routine in 15 years of service, said nothing at all, which was worse. Day 2. Captain Orsini called to report that a shipment of pharmaceutical-grade acetone, the kind used to process certain other commodities the Vescari operation moved through a network of cleaning supply companies, had not arrived at the Jersey City warehouse. The truck had been logged leaving the depot in Newark at 6 in the morning.
It had not been logged arriving anywhere since. Day 3. Polk didn't show to the morning debrief. His phone went to voicemail. His apartment in Hoboken showed signs of a rapid and recent departure. Drawers open, a coffee cup still half full on the counter, his car in the parking structure with the driver's side window left down. His second-in-command, a young man named Terso, who was visibly trying not to look as frightened as he was, delivered this information to Cassian in person and was asked only one question. "Did he say anything to you in the last week? Anything different?" Terso thought about it carefully. "He asked me once if I thought you'd ever been wrong about a person." Cassian looked at him for a long moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were wrong about me when you thought I couldn't handle the Trenton run." "And he said?" Terso hesitated. "He said that wasn't the kind of wrong he meant." Cassian sent him out and sat with that for a while. Lucien arrived at 9, as he did every morning. With the overnight summary on his tablet and a cup of coffee, he never drank past the first sip. He took the chair across from Cassian's desk with the ease of a man who had occupied that chair for 15 years, and he laid out the situation with his usual clarity. The Luxembourg freeze was likely a compliance flag triggered by the volume of the transfer, resolvable within a week. The acetone shipment was probably a driver problem. This had happened before, in 2019, and the load had turned up at a rest stop in Pennsylvania with a driver who'd had a medical event. Pollock's disappearance was more concerning, but Pollock had always been volatile, and the stress of the signing period may have pushed him somewhere Polk had decided, on his own, he didn't want to come back from. Each explanation was reasonable. Each one, by itself, would have been sufficient. Together they created a pattern that Cassian felt in his chest before he could articulate it in his mind. Who else knew about the Luxembourg transfers besides Ferris, he asked. Lucien considered this. Ferris, yourself, and the transfer agent in the Caymans, and anyone who had access to the operating ledger. Who has access to the operating ledger? Senior staff, myself. Orsini and Polk for the operational line items. Cassian watched him. Lucien met the watch with an expression of appropriate thoughtfulness, the look of a man turning over a problem, and said, "You think these things are connected. I think 3 problems in 3 days after a signing that was supposed to be the end of problems is not a coincidence. It could be opportunism. The other families testing the boundaries now that the agreement is formalized." "Which families?" "The Morettis haven't signed anything. They watched this signing from a distance, and they're not happy about what it represents for their Boston expansion." Cassian said nothing. The name Moretti sat in the room between them with a particular weight, and he watched Lucien's face for what happened to it when the name was spoken, and what happened was nothing, which was exactly what a careful man would arrange. "Pull everything we have on Moretti's operations in the last 90 days, Cassian said. "Movement, personnel, financial, everything." Of course, Lucien stood, collected his tablet. "And Polk?" "Find him." Lucien left. Cassian opened his desk drawer and looked at the ring for a moment. Then he closed the drawer. He called Breck. Breck answered on the second ring, which was what Breck always did. Let it ring once so it didn't seem urgent, answered on the second so it was clear he'd been paying attention. "The night of the signing," Cassian said, "walk me through who had contact with Polk and Orsini between 7 and 9. A brief silence. Not hesitation, the sound of a man organizing information. Orsini was at table 3 from 7 until the signing. He spoke to Ferrante's security chief during the reception, and to a woman from the Castellano family's legal side. Polk was in and out of the service corridor managing the perimeter rotation. He spoke to... A pause. He spoke to Lucien, about 20 minutes before you addressed the room. How long was the conversation? 6-7 minutes. I didn't think it was relevant. Did you hear any of it? No, they were in the corridor. I noted the contact and moved on. Another pause. Should I have flagged it? No, Cassian said. You couldn't have known. He ended the call. He sat with it. 6 years ago, he would have moved on this immediately. Would have pulled Lucien into a room and taken him apart with the specific patient brutality that had built the Vescari operation from a mid-tier Brooklyn crew into the most feared organization in the tri-state area.
But he was not 20 years ago Cassian, and he was not 6 years ago Cassian either. He had learned at significant cost that moving fast on incomplete information was how you lost things you couldn't recover. He needed proof. He needed it before Lucian understood that he was looking. He picked up his phone and called a man named Rourke, who operated independently of the Vescari organization in all visible ways and was, in every way that mattered, the most reliable private intelligence contractor Cassian had ever used. Rourke asked no questions that weren't essential and answered none that weren't asked. He was expensive in the way that reliability is always expensive, not in money, but in obligation, in the kind of favors that required things Cassian preferred not to put on paper. "I need a full communication audit," Cassian said. "Internal. Every line that touches my senior staff, 60-day window." Rourke's response was immediate. "That's going to cross some people. It's going to cross one person. That's the point. Timeline. As fast as you can run it. 72 hours. Make it 48. He ended the call and finally poured himself a second cup of coffee, which had gone cold while he was working through what Breck had told him. He drank it cold without noticing. Across the river, in the apartment above the dry cleaning shop in Sunset Park, Serena was on her 4th hour of sleep in the last 2 days. The diner meeting with Sal had happened the morning after the signing. Red Hook, 6 in the morning, a corner booth with a clear sight line to both exits and the window. Sal had arrived 4 minutes late, which for a man of his precision meant something had delayed him that he hadn't anticipated, and he'd slid into the booth with the look of a man carrying information he wasn't sure he wanted to deliver. He had delivered it anyway, because Sal understood that the value of information depreciated rapidly in their line of work, and hoarding it never served anyone. "Lucian Dre," he said. Serena had set her coffee cup down very carefully. "Don Ferrante has suspected him for about 4 months," Sal continued. "Not about you specifically, about a series of intelligence failures, Vescari information turning up in places it shouldn't have been. The Don didn't say anything because he had no proof, and because he thought it was possible Cassian was aware and managing it on his own terms. He wasn't aware." "No." Sal looked at her across the table. "The Don also thinks Lucian made a mistake with you." "What kind of mistake?" "The kind where he aimed at the wrong target, where he framed you to remove you and didn't anticipate what your removal would actually cost." Serena thought about this. "Because Lucian's plan depends on the families fracturing." "Yes. And the families were not going to fracture as long as I was—" She stopped. "As long as you were managing the relationships Cassian didn't know you were managing," Sal said, with a delicacy that surprised her, coming from a man who had spent 40 years in this world. "Yes, Lucian knew about the relationships. He clearly underestimated what removing you would trigger." "He triggered everything at once," she said. "The freeze, the shipments, the defections. He's been sitting on those moves for months." "That's what the Don believes." She sat with it for a moment, the full shape of it assembling itself in her mind. Lucien's patience, his precision, the 15 years of proximity he'd used to understand exactly which pillars held the structure up and which ones could be pulled. He'd identified her as the pillar Cassian couldn't see. He'd built a frame around her that used Cassian's own blind spots against him. He'd waited for the exact moment, the signing, the exhaustion, the fragile triumph, and he detonated it. It was, she thought, with a cold clarity that surprised her, genuinely impressive. In a different life, it would have been something to admire. "I need Ferrante to hold," she said. "Whatever he's considering in the next 72 hours, I need him to wait. He'll want something in return. He'll have it." Sal nodded slowly. "There's one more thing." He folded his hands on the table. "The coalition. The younger bosses. Ferrante's word is that 3 of them have already had conversations about moving during the chaos, not waiting to see how this resolves, moving through it." Serena looked at him. "How young?" "Young enough to think this is an opportunity. Old enough to be dangerous." She left the diner at 7:15 and spent the next 36 hours working every contact she had ever cultivated in the margins of Cassian's world. The people who answered to no family directly, who moved in the spaces between power and observed what happened there. She called in obligations she had held for years. She traded information carefully, giving enough to get what she needed,
holding back the pieces that hadn't yet matured into leverage. What she built over those 36 hours was not a counteroffensive. It was a wall, a quiet, invisible architecture of restraint, built from relationships and carefully placed obligations, designed to buy enough time for the truth to surface before the city made a decision it couldn't unmake. She did not call Cassian. She thought about it more than once, sitting at the small table in the Sunset Park apartment at 2 a.m, phone in hand, his number pulled up. She thought about it and set the phone down each time because the conversation she needed to have with him required proof, and she did not yet have proof, and Cassian Vescari in a state of partial information was a more dangerous animal than most threats she had ever managed. What she did not know was that Lucien was not waiting. On the evening of day 3, a man named Drev, who worked for the Moretti Syndicate out of Boston and had, in a previous professional incarnation, worked for Lucien directly, placed a phone call to the operating manager of the Castellano family's northeastern shipping network. The call lasted 9 minutes. At the end of it, the operating manager called his Don, and the Castellano Don called 2 of the others. And by 10 o'clock that night, something that had been theoretical, a thing discussed in hushed rooms and then set aside, became operational. The Castellano family was pulling out of the peace agreement, not loudly, not with a declaration, with the quiet and devastating efficiency of people who had decided that the Vescari syndicate's visible instability made the agreement a liability rather than an asset, and who had received from a source they trusted information suggesting that the instability was not temporary. Cassian found out at 11:15 when Ferrante's consigliere, Sal, called Breck, who called Cassian, who was still in his study. He called Orsini. Orsini answered on the 5th ring, which was not what Orsini did. Orsini picked up immediately, always, because Orsini understood that in this business, the speed of your answer was a form of loyalty declaration. 5th ring. "Tell me about Castellano," Cassian said. A pause long enough to contain several things. "I heard something." "When?" "An hour ago." "An hour." Cassian kept his voice level. It took effort. "You heard that one of the 5 families that signed the agreement 3 days ago is pulling out, and you waited an hour." "I was trying to verify—" "Who told you?" Another pause. "Lucien." The room went very quiet. Not silent. Cassian could hear the ventilation system, the distant sound of the security rotation outside, but quiet in the specific way that a room goes quiet when something enormous has been understood and has not yet been responded to. "Where are you right now?" Cassian said. "I'm at the—" Orsini stopped. The pause that followed was a different quality than the ones before it. Not the pause of a man organizing information, but the pause of a man who had just heard something in the question that changed the landscape of the conversation. "I'm at home." "Stay there." He ended the call. He stood very still in the middle of his study for about 15 seconds. Then he walked to the drawer, opened it, looked at the ring, and this time the looking was different. Not habit, not avoidance, but the specific look of a man who was beginning to understand the shape of an error and finding it so large that his eyes needed a moment to adjust. He picked up his phone and called Rourke. "I need what you have," he said. "Whatever you have right now. Don't wait for the full audit." "I have partial," Rourke said. "It's enough." "Send it." The file came through in 4 minutes. Cassian read it standing at his desk, and as he read it, the room around him seemed to lose a degree of substance. Not spinning, not dramatic, just the quiet subtraction of certainty that happens when a man discovers he has been living inside someone else's construction for a long time and is only now seeing the walls for what they are. The call logs were there. Lucien's calls to a relay number that connected through 3 separate proxies to Drev's phone. 6 calls in the 60-day window. The last one placed at 10:42 on the night of the treaty signing, from Lucien's private cell, 40 minutes after Serena had walked out of the Meridian ballroom. 40 minutes after. Cassian set the phone down. He had spent 3 days telling himself he'd made the right call. 3 days in which everything that mattered to him had begun coming apart at precise and deliberate intervals.
3 days in which the man sitting across from him every morning with a tablet and a cup of coffee he never finished had been dismantling the thing Cassian had spent 15 years building, one pillar at a time, starting with the one Cassian had removed himself. He thought about Serena's face in the moment he'd taken the ring, the quality of her stillness, the things she hadn't said. She had known. Not everything. Not Lucien's name, not yet. Or she would have said it regardless of the cost. But she had known enough to be dismantling something in the 3 weeks before the signing, and he had taken her public dismantling of that work and called it treason, and he had done it in front of every person whose respect she had spent 6 years quietly earning. He sat down in his chair.
The city outside his window was doing what it always did, moving, breathing, throwing light at the dark. And somewhere in it, Serena was in a location he didn't know, working on a problem he had caused. And Lucien Cendré was sleeping, or not sleeping, in the east wing of this house, having spent 15 years in the chair across from that desk preparing for exactly this moment. Cassian picked up his phone one more time. He called Lucien's room. It rang 6 times. 7. 8. No answer. He called the security post at the east wing entrance. "Mr. Dre left the property," the guard said. "About 40 minutes ago. He said you'd approved it." Cassian said nothing. "Mr. Vescari? Should I—" "Lock the east gate," Cassian said. "Don't let anyone in or out without my direct authorization. Anyone." He ended the call. He sat in the silence of his study with the phone in his hand and the drawer open and the ring visible in it, and he understood, with the complete and terrible clarity of a man who has just watched the floor disappear beneath a structure he believed was permanent, that he was not going to be able to fix this from the inside. Lucien was gone. The Castellano family was out. Serena was somewhere in this city, doing what she had always done, without him. And she was doing it because he had made that the only available option. He had one move left that made any sense, and it was a move that required him to do something he had not done in 15 years of building an empire on the premise that he never needed to. He was going to have to ask for help. And the only person whose help was worth having was the one person in the world he had given every possible reason to refuse him. Cassian drove himself. That alone was the signal. No driver, no security tail, no call to Breck to arrange a route. He took the Mercedes from the lower garage, the one registered to a shell company that hadn't been active in 4 years, and he drove it out through the service entrance at the back of the estate at 12:40 in the morning with his jacket on and no weapon visible. Which did not mean he was unarmed. He had one address. Not Serena's keeping. He didn't have that. What he had was the name of a man who would know where she was, because this man knew where everyone was. And because Cassian had once done him a service significant enough that the debt had never been called in, and tonight was the night it was getting called. The man's name was Priest, and he operated out of a private social club in Greenpoint that had no sign above the door and no listing anywhere that a civilian would find. Cassian had been there twice in 15 years. Both times under circumstances he preferred not to revisit. He parked 2 blocks away, walked the rest in the cold, and knocked twice on the unmarked door. A slot opened. Eyes looked at him. The slot closed. 20 seconds passed, long enough for Cassian to feel the specific discomfort of standing on a public sidewalk at 1 in the morning as a wanted man in 7 different jurisdictions. And then the door opened. Priest was in the back room, at a table with 3 other men who took one look at Cassian and found reasons to be elsewhere. Priest did not stand. He was a broad man in his mid-60s with the face of someone who had spent decades absorbing information without reacting to it, and he looked at Cassian with the particular expression of a man who had been expecting this visit and had been curious about the timing. "You look like you haven't slept," Priest said. "I need Serena's location." "Sit down." "I don't need to sit down. I need—" Cassian. The name in Priest's mouth carried a weight that was not threatening but was absolute. "Sit down." Cassian sat. Priest poured 2 glasses of something amber from a bottle he didn't introduce. He pushed one across the table. Cassian didn't touch it. "She's been in contact with 5 separate parties in the last 48 hours, Priest said. Ferrante's man, Dava Costello, 2 independents I won't name without her permission, and a man named Rin, who I understand you're familiar with. Rin works for Moretti. Rin worked for Moretti. Past tense. He's been feeding information about Moretti's Boston operation to your wife for the better part of 8 months. Priest watched Cassian's face absorb this. He's the one who told her about the frame being constructed, the calls attributed to her. He tried to help her dismantle it before the signing. The room was very quiet. She was the target, Cassian said. Not a question. She's always been the target. Lucien understood that the only way to fracture your operation from the inside was to remove the structural element you didn't know you were depending on. Priest picked up his glass. He also understood that you'd do the work for him if he gave you the right evidence at the right moment. Cassian put his hand flat on the table. His jaw was set in a way that had nothing to do with anger, or it had everything to do with anger, but the anger was pointed entirely inward, which was a different thing and a much more dangerous one. "Where is she?" he said. Priest looked at him for a moment. "Before I tell you that, there's something you need to know first, something she doesn't know I'm going to tell you, which means after tonight I'll have burned whatever goodwill I have left with her, so understand that I'm doing this because I think the alternative is worse." Cassian waited. 12 years ago, Priest said, the ambush on the West Side Highway. You remember it. Cassian remembered it. A convoy ambush in February, 3 vehicles, coordinated and professional. 2 of his men had died in the first 30 seconds. He had survived because of a vehicle intervention, a black SUV that had come out of a side street and deliberately rammed the lead attack car, creating enough confusion for Cassian's driver to get him out. They had never identified the SUV or its occupants. The investigation had gone cold within a month, and Cassian had filed it in the part of his memory where he kept things that had no resolution and required no further examination. "That was Serena," Priest said. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who hadn't heard. It was the silence of a man whose entire architecture of the past 12 years had just shifted on its foundation. She'd gotten word of the ambush through a contact in the Gallo family 24 hours before it happened, Priest continued. She came to me. She wasn't yet... You two had been together less than a year. She wasn't your wife yet. She was a woman who had found out that the man she was with was going to be killed on a Wednesday morning, and she made a decision. She never told me. No. Why? Priest set his glass down. She said, and I'm using her words because mine wouldn't do it justice. She said that if she told you, you'd want to know how she knew, and how she knew would tell you things about who she was and what she was capable of that would change how you saw her. And she wasn't ready for you to see her differently. She wanted more time to be just a person to you. He paused. She also said that men like you don't handle being saved well, that you'd spend the rest of your life trying to account for it in ways that would damage both of you. Cassian said nothing. She was right on both counts, Priest said, which is why she never told you, and why I'm telling you now, because you are about to walk into a situation that requires you to understand exactly who you are dealing with and exactly what you threw away 3 nights ago in that ballroom. Cassian picked up the glass and drank from it, put it back down. Where is she? He said, and his voice was different now. Not softer, but different in a way that was harder to categorize. Stripped of something. The particular quality that power gives a man's voice when he believes the power is what makes him worth listening to. Priest gave him the address. Cassian stood. He was at the door when Priest spoke again. She's not alone there anymore. He turned. She had a visitor 2 hours ago, Priest said. 3 men. Not hostile. She let them in. But I'd move quickly. Cassian moved quickly. The address was a building in Red Hook, 6 blocks from the diner Serena had used for her meeting with Sal. Cassian parked and took the stairs and knocked on the door of the 3rd-floor apartment with a force that was not quite a bang, but was close. The door opened, and the man who opened it was not Serena. He was packed, mid-40s, with the posture of someone who had spent years in rooms where the wrong posture got you killed. Cassian recognized him after a second. Marco Vitale, who ran the Ferrante family's enforcement operations, and who had, in Cassian's considered estimation, never once in his life done anything without the explicit instruction of Don Ferrante himself. Behind Vitale, the apartment was occupied. Serena was at the table. Beside her was a woman Cassian recognized as Dava Costello. Across from them was Sal, Ferrante's consigliere. And at the window,
Standing with his arms folded and his back partially turned was a fourth person Cassian had not expected. Don Ferrante himself. 71 years old, buried 2 sons, had not left his compound in Westchester for a public meeting in 4 years. He was standing in a third-floor apartment in Red Hook at 2 in the morning in a cardigan and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and when he turned to look at Cassian in the doorway, his expression was not surprise. "I wondered when you'd find your way here," Ferrante said. Cassian looked at Serena. Serena looked back at him with an expression that was completely neutral in the way that only extreme control produces neutrality, and he understood that whatever conversation this was, he had arrived in the middle of it and was not currently in a position to dictate its terms. "Come in," Serena said. Not warm, not cold. Precise. He came in. Vitale closed the door behind him. Cassian stood in the middle of the small room with 4 people looking at him and his wife sitting at the table with her hands folded and the bare left hand visible, and did the thing he had almost never done in his adult life. He didn't speak first. Ferrante spoke. "We've been having a conversation about what comes next. Your wife has been generous enough to share her assessment of the situation. Deva has confirmed certain financial details. Sal has communicated the position of my family." He paused. "We were about to reach a decision." "What decision?" Cassian said. "Whether to rebuild the alliance without you," Serena said. The words were flat. Informational. She said them the way you state a coordinate. This is where we are. This is the point on the map. No cruelty in them, no satisfaction, just the truth of it, placed in the room without apology. Cassian looked at her for a moment. "And what was the answer going to be?" "We hadn't gotten there yet," Ferrante said. "You interrupted the deliberation." "Then I'll wait." Something moved across Dava Costello's face. Not quite surprise, but the revision of an expectation. She was a woman in her 50s who had spent 3 decades in rooms full of men who didn't wait for anything, and she looked at Cassian with the expression of someone recalibrating. Ferrante studied him. "Sit down, Cassian." Cassian sat. Same chair he'd been told to sit in by Priest an hour ago, which struck him as the universe making a point about the evening's themes. He sat, and he folded his hands on the table, and he looked at Serena and said, before Ferrante could redirect the conversation, "I know about the highway. 12 years ago." The room changed. Not dramatically. No one gasped. No one moved. But something shifted in the quality of the air, and Serena's hands, folded on the table, went very still. "Priest told you," she said. "Yes." She took a breath through her nose. Let it out. "He shouldn't have done that." "No," Cassian said. "He should have done it 12 years ago. And I should have known." He held her gaze. "I should have known a lot of things I didn't know because you were handling them without me, and I let you do that because it suited me to not have to ask questions about how things got handled. And then when someone showed me paper that said you were working against me, I used that. I used the fact that I'd never asked questions as evidence that I should have been asking questions all along." He stopped. "I was wrong. Not just about the evidence, about all of it, about what I was looking at every day without seeing it." The room absorbed this. Ferrante looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Serena. Serena looked at Cassian with the expression of a woman who was deciding whether what she had just heard was real and what it was worth if it was. "You came here to say that. I came here because Lucien is gone and the Castellano family is out, and my operation is being dismantled from the inside, and the only person who has ever successfully managed all of those kinds of problems at once is sitting in this room." He paused. "But yes, I also came to say that." Ferrante made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Your timing," he said, "has always been your most significant flaw." "I'm aware." "The Castellano defection is not the problem," Deva said, speaking for the first time since Cassian had entered. She had a direct, unhurried way of talking that came from decades of legal practice in rooms where directness was a survival mechanism. "The problem is what the defection signals. 3 of the younger operators, Brennan from the dockworkers faction, the 2 Sett brothers from the Northeastern Corridor, they've been watching this situation since the signing. They're not waiting for the families to resolve it. They're moving through it." "Moving how?" Cassian said. "Taking positions. Warehouse territories on the Jersey side. 2 shipping contracts that belong to the Ferrante family's legitimate holdings."
They're not attacking anyone directly. They're filling the space that opens up when people are distracted. They'll escalate. They'll escalate the moment they believe the distraction is permanent, Serena said, which means we have a window, a small one. She unfolded her hands, placed them flat on the table. Lucien is the priority. Not because of what he did to me. Because he's the one coordinating the intelligence feeding to these operators. Without him, their information goes dark, and they're moving blind. With him they know every move before it happens, Cassian finished. Where is he? Ferrante said. I don't know yet, Cassian said. I have a partial communication audit, enough to confirm what he's been doing, but not where he ran to. I know where he is, Serena said. Everyone in the room looked at her. She looked at Cassian. Rin told me 2 hours ago. There's a property in Red Hook, not far from here actually, registered to a holding company that traces back to the Moretti organization. Lucien has been using it as a dead drop site for the last 4 months. Rin believes he's there now, or will be by morning. He has a meeting scheduled, the Set brothers. The weight of it settled over the room. He's building his coalition, Ferrante said. Quietly. The voice of a man watching something he'd predicted come true, and taking no pleasure in the accuracy. Yes, Serena said. If he meets with the Sete brothers and those meetings go the way Lucien intends them to, Deva said, we lose the window. The younger operators unify under Lucien's coordination, and the chaos becomes structured. That's a different problem than the one we have now. Different and worse, Sal said. His first words in 20 minutes, delivered with the precision of a man who had been waiting until they were necessary. Structured opposition with inside intelligence is not a crisis, it's a war. Cassian looked at the table, at his hands, at the distance between his hands and Serena's hands, 6 inches of scarred wood. What do you need from me? He said, directed at Serena, not at Ferrante, not at the room, at her. She looked at him. I need you to not do what you would normally do, she said. I need you to not take men to that property and hit it the way you'd hit any other problem. Lucien is expecting that. He's prepared for that. He has whatever he's been holding in reserve deployed around that location, and if you go in loud, you give the Sete brothers exactly the incident they need to justify a full offensive response. Then how? You go in alone, she said, or close to it. You make it a conversation, not a raid. You give Lucien the chance to believe he still has the upper hand, because as long as he believes that, he stays in that room instead of running. And once he stays, you expose him, Ferrante said, in front of the Sete brothers, in front of whoever else he's assembled. In front of everyone who matters, Serena said, with the communication logs, with the financial trail, with everything Rin has provided about the Moretti connection. She paused. The younger operators aren't loyal to Lucien. They're loyal to whoever has the cleanest claim to order. You show them that Lucien's entire operation is built on a fabricated frame and a betrayal of the man who built this city's peace, and they don't have a reason to follow him anymore. The room was quiet. Then Ferrante said, and if Lucien doesn't stay for the conversation? If he reads Cassian walking in and decides the risk isn't worth it? Serena said, then Cassian improvises, which he's reasonably good at. It was so close to a normal thing for her to say, the dry, sideways acknowledgement of something real, that it landed differently than anything else in the room. Dava looked at the table. Sal's expression shifted. Even Vitale, standing by the door, moved slightly. Cassian looked at her, and something in his face did something that it hadn't done in the 3 days since the Meridian Hotel. It didn't soften exactly. It cracked. A small, visible fracture in the surface of the man who had spent his entire adult life ensuring that no one in any room could read what was happening underneath. All right, he said. Ferrante pushed himself upright from the window with the slow deliberateness of a man managing old joints. He looked at Cassian for a moment with an expression that was not forgiveness. These were not men whose world ran on forgiveness, but was something adjacent to it. The specific regard of a patriarch who has watched a younger man understand something at significant cost and is choosing to treat the understanding as more relevant than the cost. My family will hold the perimeter, Ferrante said.
Quietly. You won't see us. I know, Cassian said. I never do. He stood. He picked up his phone from the table where he'd set it when he sat down. He looked at Serena one more time. She was looking back at him with an expression he knew, had known for 9 years, had understood as a form of love once, and had thrown it away 3 days ago, and was only now beginning to understand the full dimension of what he'd thrown. The expression that said, I see you, all of it, the good and the damage and the space between them. I see it, and I'm still here. For now. The property address, he said. She gave it to him, a street and a number, 6 blocks away. He walked to the door. Vitaly moved aside. Cassian, Serena said. He stopped. Don't confuse going in alone with going in like you have nothing to lose, she said. You have things to lose. Remember that while you're in there. He didn't answer. But he didn't leave immediately either. He stood in the doorway for 1 second longer than he needed to, which was the only answer he had available. And then he went down the stairs and out into the Red Hook night, with the cold coming off the water and 6 blocks between him and the man who had spent 15 years sitting across from him, learning everything there was to know about how to destroy him. The building was a converted warehouse on a dead-end street that backed against the water. 2 loading bays, both shuttered. A personnel door on the south face with a light above it that was working. 2 vehicles in the small lot. A dark SUV and a panel van that had no markings and sat too low on its chassis for a vehicle that was supposed to be empty. Cassian stood at the corner of the street and looked at it for a full minute. He thought about what Serena had said. Don't confuse going in alone with going in like you have nothing to lose. He had spent a long time operating as if losing was not a real outcome, as if the scale of his operation and the reputation he'd built made loss a theoretical rather than a practical category. He had used that certainty as a form of armor and had never examined what it cost the people around him to maintain it. He understood now what it had cost. He started walking toward the personnel door. He was 4 steps from it when it opened from the inside, and the man who stepped out was not Lucian. It was Orsini. Orsini, who had answered on the 5th ring. Orsini, who had known about Castellano an hour before he reported it. Orsini, who had been at the table at the signing when Lucian spoke to Polk in the corridor. They looked at each other in the single working light above the door, and Orsini's face went through 4 things in rapid succession. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been shame, and then the particular blankness of a man who has decided that the situation has moved past the point where emotion serves any purpose. How many inside? Cassian said. Orsini looked at him for a long moment. The cold came off the water. A container ship moved somewhere in the dark behind the building, its horn low and distant. 7, Orsini said, plus Lucien. The Sette brothers and their people arrived 20 minutes ago. He paused. He told us you'd come alone if you came at all. He said it was a weakness. He was right. He's been right about a lot of things. Has he been right about enough of them to be worth following? Orsini looked at his shoes, then at Cassian. He told me about your wife, the Boston calls. I believed him because I wanted to believe the problem was that simple. And now? Now Polk is in the wind and I'm standing outside a building I shouldn't be in, and you're asking me how many people are inside. He exhaled slowly. What happens if I walk away right now? Nothing, Cassian said. From me. Tonight. Orsini held his gaze, weighing it. Then he stepped aside from the door. 7, he said again. Lucien is in the back office on the 2nd floor. Sette brothers are in the main floor space with their 4 people. There's 1 man on the stairs. He paused. He's not going to expect you to walk through the front. No, Cassian said. He's going to expect me to try to think like him. He put his hand on the door. I'm done thinking like him. He opened the door and went in, and behind him Orsini stood in the cold for a moment, then turned and walked away into the dark without looking back, and the door swung closed on its pneumatic hinge with a sound like a held breath finally released. The inside of the building smelled like river water and machine oil, and the particular cold of a space that has been heated intermittently and never quite warmed through. Cassian stood in the entry corridor and let his eyes adjust. 1 overhead fluorescent, half its tubes dead, throwing uneven yellow light across a concrete floor that hadn't been cleaned in months. To his left, a staircase. Ahead, a set of double doors with light bleeding under them. Voices behind the doors. Low, male, the cadence of men in a preliminary conversation, not yet at the thing they came to discuss, still in the circling phase. He counted at least 3 distinct voices. The Set brothers, Lucien had said, and their people. 4 of them total, plus the brothers themselves. The man on the stairs was sitting on the 4th step, with his forearms on his knees and his phone in his hands, the screen throwing blue light up at his face. Young, 25 at most, the kind of young that still believed that being in the right room was the same as being protected by it. Cassian moved. He covered the distance to the stairs in 8 steps, silent on the concrete, and had the man's phone out of his hands and his arm up his back before the kid processed that someone was in the building. One hard push, and the man's face met the wall beside the staircase with enough force to stun, but not enough to do permanent damage. He went down without a sound that carried. Cassian took the stairs. 2nd floor. A corridor with 3 doors, 2 of them open onto dark rooms. The 3rd at the end had light under it, and the sound of Lucien's voice, which Cassian had been listening to for 15 years and could identify through walls. He did not slow down. He hit the door with his shoulder at full stride, and it gave immediately, cheaper hardware than the building deserved, and he was inside before anyone in the room had time to stand. The office was small and overlit. A folding table, 4 chairs, a portable space heater in the corner that was working too hard and making the room smell like burnt dust. Lucien was at the table. Across from him were 2 men Cassian recognized as Dante and Carlo Sette, brothers, mid-30s, the kind of men who had grown up watching their father's generation bleed each other out and had concluded the lesson was about efficiency rather than restraint. Beside each brother, a man standing. That was the 4. All 6 of them looked at Cassian. Lucien's face did something interesting. It went through surprise. Genuine, Cassian noted, which meant Orsini had not called ahead, and then into a rapid, almost visible recalibration, and then settled into an expression that was composed in the way that things are composed when the composure is the product of effort rather than ease. Cassian, Lucien said. Don't, Cassian said. Whatever the first sentence was going to be, don't. One of the standing men moved, and Cassian had his weapon out before the movement completed. Not pointed at Lucien, pointed at the man who'd moved. Sit down, or I'll put you down. Your choice. Make it fast. The man sat. Both of them, Cassian said. The second standing man sat. Dante Set had not moved at all. He was watching Cassian with the flat, assessing look of a man who is constantly running calculations, and his calculation right now appeared to be, how dangerous is this? And is it more dangerous than whatever comes next? He had the look of someone who had not yet decided. You followed the address, Lucien said. Serena gave it to you. Yes. Then she's closer to this than I thought. Something shifted in Lucien's expression. Not fear, the adjustment of a man revising a variable. How much did she tell you? Enough. The Moretti connection, Lucien said. The call logs. Rin. He said it with a kind of clinical precision, checking off items. Did she tell you about the Luxembourg accounts? The freeze was yours. Obviously. Lucien leaned back slightly in his chair. It was a studied movement, the posture of a man trying to control the pace of a room he no longer controlled, which Cassian recognized because he'd used it himself. The freeze, the acetone shipment, the intelligence I fed to the Castellano family through their financial counsel. He paused. Polk's departure was his own decision, for what it's worth. I didn't arrange that. He decided the ship was sinking. The ship was being sunk, deliberately, by you. Yes, Lucien said, simply, without the defensiveness of a man who feels he needs to justify himself. By me. Over 14 months. Since it became clear that the direction you were taking this organization was going to end it. The peace agreement was going to end it. The peace agreement made us equal to 4 other families that we should have been superior to. You traded dominance for stability, and you called it vision. Something moved in Lucien's voice now. The first real emotion in the room, and it was not guilt.
It was genuine conviction, which was in some ways worse. I built this with you 15 years, and you were going to sign it away because your wife convinced you that negotiated peace was strength. She was right. She was managing you, Lucian said. She was managing all of us. The families, the relationships, the quiet diplomacy she ran without your knowledge. She built herself into the infrastructure and called it loyalty. What she was doing was making herself indispensable, making sure that nothing worked without her. His voice was level, persuasive, the voice of a man who had spent 15 years being the most reasonable person in the room. I removed her because the architecture she built was a trap. Not for you, for the organization. Cassian looked at him for a long moment. You believe that? Yes. You believe that the woman who saved my life 12 years ago and never told me she'd done it because she didn't want to make me feel indebted was building a trap. Lucian's composure cracked, one small fracture around the eyes. The highway. The highway, Cassian confirmed. Silence. Carloset spoke for the first time, and his voice was careful, the voice of a man inserting himself into a conversation at a moment he'd identified as useful. This is Vescari business. Whatever this is, it's between you two. We came here for a different conversation. You came here, Cassian said, without looking away from Lucien, because this man told you that the Vescari operation was collapsing, and that the right move was to position yourselves to absorb the territories when it did. He told you he'd have inside intelligence on every move the remaining families made, because he built the intelligence infrastructure and controls it. Now he looked at Dante Sette. What he didn't tell you is that the intelligence he's been using is fabricated. It's built on falsified communication logs and manipulated financial records and a 15-month campaign to frame a woman who was the reason your families and mine weren't at war 3 years ago. Dante Sette's expression was unreadable. That's a significant claim. Cassian reached into his jacket and put the partial audit on the table. Rourke's file, printed before he left the estate. 8 pages of call architecture and financial tracing with timestamps and proxy chain documentation. He slid it across to Dante. Dante looked at it, looked at Lucien. Lucien's jaw was set. The composure was back, harder now, the kind that comes after a crack has been sealed rather than the kind that was never broken. That documentation is incomplete, partial. Whatever Rourke gave you is... Rourke gave me the calls, Cassian said. Priest gave me the rest. And Serena's contact at the Moretti operation gave her the property and the meeting schedule. He looked at Lucien steadily. You've been careful. You are genuinely careful, and I should acknowledge that, because 15 years is a long time to run a secondary operation inside the primary one without a single visible mistake. But you made one error. Lucien waited. You assumed I was the only person paying attention, Cassian said. You planned for me. You planned for my blind spots, my ego, my tendency to move on incomplete information. You built the frame around Serena specifically because you understood that I'd react to evidence about her before I'd question the evidence itself. His voice was controlled, but underneath it something was moving, something that had been building for 3 days and was finding its shape. What you didn't plan for was her. She's not here, Lucien said. No, Cassian said. She's 6 blocks away in a room with Don Ferrante. Lucien went very still. Ferrante, Carloset said slowly. Ferrante is in Red Hook tonight, Cassian said to the brothers. His consigliere has been in contact with Serena for 48 hours. His family has the perimeter of this building covered right now. Every exit. He watched their faces process this. You came here tonight for a business meeting. What you actually walked into was the documentation of a conspiracy that used fabricated evidence to fracture a peace agreement that every family in this city spent a year building. And the man who built that conspiracy is sitting across this table from you. Dante Sette looked at the papers in his hands, looked at Lucien. The calculation on his face was visible now, the rapid reassessment of a position that had appeared solid 20 minutes ago and was now demonstrably unstable. This isn't what we were told, Dante said. No, Cassian said, it isn't. Lucien moved. Not toward Cassian, away from him, toward the space heater and the wall behind it, and Cassian was already turning when he understood what was happening. Behind the space heater, at floor level, a panel. Old building, old construction, service access for the heating system that ran under the floor. Lucien hit the floor and had the panel open in one motion, and Cassian covered the 6 feet between them and caught his ankle. Lucien kicked, hard, the heel connecting with Cassian's forearm with enough force to send a shock up to his shoulder. Cassian held. Lucien kicked again, caught him in the face this time, a glancing blow that split the skin above his cheekbone and sent white light across his vision for 1 second. He held. The 2 men Cassian had made sit were on their feet. Carlos said something sharp to his brother. Dante put his hand up and the 2 men stopped, and in the brief cessation, Cassian got both hands on Lucien's ankle and pulled with everything he had, and Lucien came back from the panel across the concrete floor with a sound that scraped. Cassian got on top of him. He had Lucien's collar in both hands, and Lucien's back against the floor, and his knee in Lucien's sternum, and his face 6 inches from Lucien's face. And they were both breathing hard, Lucien from the struggle and Cassian from something that was not entirely physical. The accumulated weight of 3 days and 15 years, and a highway in February 12 years ago, converging on this floor in this room. "Don't," Cassian said. 1 word. His voice was scraped. Lucien looked up at him. He was breathing in sharp, shallow pulls. The composure was gone now. Fully, finally. And underneath it was something that was almost a relief. The look of a man who has been performing a version of himself for so long that being caught has a component of exhaustion lifting. "You can't hold this together," Lucien said, between breaths. "Even with the documentation, even if the sets walk away tonight. The Castellano family is out, the Luxembourg accounts are frozen, the acetone network is gone. You have an operation with holes in it that Serena will fix," Cassian said. Lucien made a sound, not a laugh, something involuntary. "You still don't see it. Even now, you still need her to sus—" "Yes," Cassian said. "I need her to. That's not a weakness. That's the thing I should have understood 3 days ago." He stood up. He stepped back. He looked at Lucien on the floor, breathing, disheveled, the architecture of 15 years of patient construction fully visible now as exactly what it had been, a long, careful betrayal running beneath everything like water under ice, invisible until the moment the weight of everything above it finally broke through. "Get up," Cassian said. Lucien got up slowly, using the wall. He straightened his jacket. Old habit. He looked at Cassian and then at the Seta brothers, reading the room with the last reserves of a man trying to locate an angle. There was no angle. Dante Sete set the papers on the table. He looked at his brother. Some communication passed between them that required no words. The language of men who have known each other their entire lives. Then Dante looked at Cassian. "We want to be in the room when this gets presented to the families," Dante said. "You'll be in the room," Cassian said. "And we want the northeastern shipping contracts released from the current freeze, independent of whatever restructuring happens to the Vescar. One problem at a time," Cassian said. Dante considered this and nodded once. Carlo spoke. "What about him?" Meaning Lucien. Lucien was standing against the wall with his hands at his sides, and his face carrying the particular blankness of a man who has concluded that his immediate options have narrowed to a single point. Cassian's phone buzzed. He looked at it. A message from a number he didn't have stored. 5 words. "Building south. Now. Bring him." "Serena." He looked at Lucien. "You're going to walk out of this building and get in my car. And then? And then you're going to sit in a room with Don Ferrante and every person whose trust you've spent 15 months destroying, and you're going to answer questions. All of them. Starting with who else inside the Vescari operation you turned, and ending with the full Moretti financial arrangement." He held Lucien's gaze. "Or you run. Right now, through whatever exit you think isn't covered, and we see how far you get." Lucien looked at the covered exits. He couldn't see. He didn't run. They went down the stairs in a particular order. Cassian behind Lucien, the Set brothers behind Cassian, the 4 others behind them. A procession that would have looked strange from the outside and looked stranger from the inside. A man walking freely toward a room that would take apart everything he'd built without a single visible restraint on him, because the restraint was not physical. It was the math. Lucien was doing the math. He had always done the math. And the math tonight said that running bought him hours, maybe a day, and at the end of that day he'd be in a much smaller room with much less negotiating leverage than the one Cassian was offering him right now. Lucien understood leverage. It was, in the end, the only language they both shared. The cold hit them when Cassian pushed open the south door. The water smell was stronger on this side, the harbor close enough that they could hear it moving in the dark. And standing in the small lit space between the building and the lot were Serena and Sal and Vitale, and behind them the unmistakable silhouette of Don Ferrante in his cardigan, who had apparently decided that 6 blocks was close enough to walk. Lucien stopped. He looked at Ferrante for a moment, then at Serena. Serena looked at him with an expression that was not triumph. She was not a woman who performed triumph, but was something quieter and more final. The look of a woman who has spent months carefully dismantling a trap someone built around her and has just watched the last wall of it come down. "Lucien," Ferrante said. His voice was quiet in the cold air, the voice of a man with nothing to prove by volume. Lucien said nothing. "You made one mistake," Ferrante said. "Not the plan. The plan was reasonable. The intelligence was well constructed. The timing was sophisticated." He paused. "Your mistake was believing that what Serena built was a structure, something with walls and a foundation that could be removed and replaced." He looked at her briefly. "What she built was trust, and you cannot remove trust by removing the person who earned it. You can only demonstrate by removing them that you never understood what you were looking at." The lot was quiet except for the water and the sound of a distant road. Lucien looked at Cassian. "When this is over, when the families have heard everything and made their decisions, what happens to me?" Cassian looked at Serena. Serena said, "That's not my decision." "I know," Lucien said. "I'm asking anyway." She looked at him for a moment. The question was real, and she treated it as real, which was the thing about her that Lucien had never fully accounted for in any of his calculations. That her precision was not coldness, that her control was not indifference, and that the woman he had spent 15 months trying to dismantle had never once stopped being more human than the operation she'd been running inside. "That depends on what you give us tonight," she said. "All of it, every name, every account, every communication you've had with the Moretti organization in the last 14 months. She paused. "Give us everything and there's a conversation to be had. Hold anything back and there isn't." Lucien absorbed this. Then he looked at the building behind them, the dark water behind that, the exits that were covered in ways he could feel but not see. He looked at Cassian, who was watching him with the patient, exhausted certainty of a man who has run out of room for anything except what's in front of him. He looked at Ferrante, who was watching him the way old men watch things they've already made their peace with. He looked at Serena last, who was watching him the way she watched everything, with complete attention and no performance, seeing exactly what was there without any investment in seeing something else. He nodded, one small movement of his head in the cold air above the Red Hook waterfront, and with it the last 15 months of construction, the fabricated logs, the frozen accounts, the manipulated intelligence, the patient, meticulous architecture of betrayal, came down as completely and finally as things come down when the person who built them is the one who stops holding them up. Vitale moved forward and put his hand on Lucien's arm, not roughly, and they started toward the vehicles. Cassian stood where he was for a moment. Serena stood 4 feet away. The space between them held everything that had happened in the last 3 days, and everything that had happened in the last 12 years, and everything they were going to have to work through on the other side of tonight, which was a very large amount of everything for 4 feet of cold harbor air to contain. "How's your face?" she said. He touched the cut above his cheekbone. It had been bleeding quietly and had largely stopped. "It's fine." "It's not fine. You need to clean it." "I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. The distance between them was still 4 feet. "There's a building on Murray Street," she said. "The Castellano family's legal counsel has their offices on the 3rd floor. At 9 in the morning they receive their clients.
If we are sitting in that waiting room at 8:45 with the documentation and Ferrante's name on the request, we have a window to address the defection before it becomes formal. 8:45, Cassian said. Yes. That's 7 hours. Yes. He looked at her. Are you going to sleep? No. Neither am I, he said. She looked at him for one more moment, and the 4 feet remained 4 feet, which was not the same as it had been 3 days ago. It was not the distance of banishment, not the distance of a man who had decided she was an enemy. It was the distance of 2 people standing at the beginning of something difficult that had no clean resolution, only the daily, unglamorous work of reconstruction, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. Come on then, she said. She turned and walked toward the vehicles, and Cassian stood in the cold for one more second, feeling the cut above his eye, and the ache in his forearm where Lucien's heel had connected, and the particular physical weight of a night that had taken everything he had. And then he followed her, because there was nowhere else to go, and because she was, as she had always been, already 3 steps ahead and moving toward the next problem with the kind of steadiness that had nothing to do with certainty and everything to do with character. Behind them, in the building, the space heater in the second-floor office hummed against the empty room, and the panel in the wall that Lucien had almost made it through sat open on the dark access space beneath the floor, and the single working light above the south door burned on into the harbor night with nobody left to see it. The car doors closed. The vehicles moved. And 6 blocks away, in a building on Murray Street that would not open its doors for another 7 hours, the last act of everything that had started in the Meridian Hotel ballroom was waiting to begin. The waiting room on the 3rd floor of the Murray Street building had 6 chairs, a window that faced a brick wall, and a receptionist who arrived at 8:50 instead of 8:45 and did not apologize for it. Cassian and Serena sat in 2 of the 6 chairs with 18 inches between them. Cassian had cleaned the cut above his cheekbone in the bathroom of an all-night diner 3 blocks away, where they had also drunk coffee that tasted like it had been made sometime the previous afternoon and reheated twice since. The cut had a small strip of medical tape over it now, slightly crooked, which Serena had applied without comment and which he had not adjusted because adjusting it would have required acknowledging it. They had spent the 7 hours between Red Hook and Murray Street working. Ferrante's people had secured Lucien in a location Cassian was not told, which he understood was a form of assurance. Ferrante taking custody meant Ferrante was invested in the outcome, which meant the testimony would be protected until it could be used. Rourke had delivered the full audit at 5 in the morning, 43 pages of call architecture and financial documentation that was, in Rourke's precise and economical language, sufficient for any purpose you might have in mind. Dava Costello had spent 4 hours on the phone with legal contacts in Luxembourg and had, through means she did not detail, initiated the process to unfreeze the Vescari operating accounts. Not fully, not immediately, but enough to demonstrate that the freeze was not terminal. The Castellano defection was the problem that could not be solved overnight, which was why they were in this waiting room. The Castellano family's legal counsel was a woman named Greta Maris, 63, who had practiced in this city for 35 years and had the reputation of someone who had seen enough to be unsurprisable and had decided, somewhere in her 40s, that the most valuable thing she could offer her clients was a complete absence of panic. She came out of her office at 9:04, looked at the 2 of them in her waiting room, looked at the folder Cassian held, and said, "Don Ferrante called me at 6 this morning." "I know," Cassian said. "Come in." The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Cassian had been in difficult rooms his entire adult life, rooms where the wrong word ended things that couldn't be restarted, and this room ranked among the most difficult. Not because Greta Maris was hostile, but because she was precise in a way that required precision in return, and precision was not his natural register. He was a man built for force and decision and the particular momentum of certainty. Sitting across from a woman who asked methodical questions and waited without expression for complete answers required him to operate at a speed that felt, in his current state of sleeplessness and accumulated damage, like holding something very heavy, very still. Serena answered most of the questions, not because Cassian couldn't. He could, and did, when the questions were operational or financial.
But the questions that mattered, the ones that determined whether Greta Maris would pick up the phone and call the Castellano Don and recommend reconsideration, were questions about relationships, about history, about the architecture of trust that had held the city's underworld in a state of cold stability for 6 years, and who had built it, and how, and whether that architecture still existed, or whether the events of the past week had brought it down permanently. Those questions Serena answered. She answered them without dramatics and without self-pity. She laid out, in plain and specific terms, what she had done over 6 years, the truces she had negotiated, the intelligence she had managed, the assassination attempts she had quietly dismantled before they reached the point of action. She named names and dates and locations with a specificity that made the room very quiet, because the specificity made it real in a way that claims without detail never are. And when she reached the Castellano family's particular history, a border dispute in the Bronx 3 years earlier that had come within hours of becoming a shooting war before Serena had intervened through back channels neither family knew about, Greta Maris set her pen down and looked at her for a long moment. "The Castellano Don doesn't know you did that," Greta said. "No." "Why not?" "Because if he'd known I did it, he would have wanted to know how I knew what I knew to do it. And that would have required Cassian to acknowledge operational intelligence he wasn't supposed to have." She paused. "It was easier for everyone if it just resolved." Greta picked her pen back up. She wrote something, which she had not done for the last 20 minutes. "I'll make a call," she said. They were back in the waiting room at 11:40. Cassian sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and his eyes on the middle distance. Serena sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and after a while she said, without looking at him, "You should eat something." "I'm fine." "You haven't eaten since the diner. The coffee doesn't count." "I know what counts." She looked at him then, sideways, with an expression that was very close to the expression she'd used on him for 9 years when he was doing the thing he always did, insisting on his own adequacy at moments when his adequacy was visibly in question. It was a look that had always made him feel, in some complicated way he'd never examined, both seen and irritated. He felt both of those things now. "There's a place on the corner," she said. "They'll still be serving breakfast." He looked at her. "You want to go get breakfast?" "I want you to not pass out in this waiting room." They went to the corner place. It was narrow and warm and smelled like butter and coffee that was actually fresh. They sat at a table by the window and ordered without discussing it. Eggs, toast, more coffee. The waitress was a young woman who looked at the tape on Cassian's cheekbone and then looked away with the practiced incuriosity of someone who had worked a neighborhood like this one long enough to understand that some things were not her business. They ate in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence. A silence with texture, the kind that exists between people who have known each other long enough that quiet doesn't require explanation. "The Set brothers," Cassian said. "They'll hold," Serena said. "Dante is practical. He came last night for a business arrangement and found a different one. He's not loyal to anything except the cleaner deal and the Northeastern shipping contracts. I'll work it out with Ferrante. There's room." Boop. She drank her coffee. "The acetone network is the longer problem. That's going to take 4 months minimum to rebuild through different channels." "I know." "And Polk made his choice." "Polk was frightened," she said, not defending him, stating a condition. "He saw the structure coming apart and he didn't know it was being deliberately dismantled. He thought it was falling on its own, which meant he thought you'd built something that couldn't hold." Cassian looked at his plate. Maybe he wasn't entirely wrong. She didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window at the street. A delivery truck, a woman pushing a stroller, a man arguing on his phone with the specific energetic despair of someone whose argument is not going well. Ordinary city morning, the kind of morning that happened regardless of what occurred the previous night in buildings by the water. "He wasn't entirely wrong," she said finally. "There were real gaps. Not just the ones Lucian created. There were things you'd built that depended on conditions that weren't sustainable." She looked back at him. "That's what I was trying to tell you, not through the peace agreement. That was part of it. But what I was actually trying to do was create enough stability that you'd have time to see the gaps yourself, without a crisis forcing the issue." And instead I handed Lucien the crisis. Yes. He put his fork down. How long did you know it was him? I suspected for about 6 weeks. Knew with reasonable certainty for 3. She picked up her coffee. I needed the communication architecture. Without the calls, I couldn't prove it was fabrication rather than coincidence. Rin was trying to get me what I needed, but he was working from inside the Moretti organization, and the access was limited. If I'd told you, you would have moved on Lucien immediately, and Lucien would have known you were moving, and the frame he'd built around me would have been the first thing he deployed, and you would have been choosing between your consigliere of 15 years and a wife you had 6 weeks of suspicion about. She set the cup down with a precision that was not violence, but was not gentleness either. I know how you think, Cassian. I have spent 9 years knowing how you think, and I made a calculation that the right move was to finish building the proof before I brought it to you. And the signing night, he moved faster than I expected. For the first time, something underneath the control surfaced briefly, like a shape moving underwater. I was 10 days away. Maybe 2 weeks. I had the call architecture mapped. I needed the Moretti financial connection documented, and I had Rin getting it from the inside. She looked at her plate. He didn't wait. They sat with that. The waitress refilled their coffee without being asked, set the pot down, moved on, traffic outside. The ordinary morning continuing its ordinary business. The highway, Cassian said. Serena was quiet. Why didn't you tell me? He said. Not the reasons Priest gave me. Your reasons. She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. Her left hand, the bare one. She looked at it for a moment as if considering the absence of the ring rather than the ring itself, which was a different kind of looking. Because the man I was with when it happened was not someone who could receive that information and stay the same, she said. You were 29 years old, and you had just consolidated the Brooklyn operation, and you were running on the specific kind of certainty that very capable people run on when they haven't yet been genuinely broken by anything. She paused. If I'd told you that I'd found out about the ambush and intervened, you would have had to know that I had sources you didn't know about, that I'd kept information from you, that I was capable of moving on things independently without your knowledge. And instead of understanding that as partnership, you would have understood it as a threat to the structure of how you saw yourself. He looked at her. You didn't trust me with it. I didn't trust you with it yet, she said, the precision of the word deliberate and fair. I was trying to be patient. She looked out the window. I was patient for 12 years. He let that sit where it landed, which was directly, without deflection. The ring is in my desk drawer, he said. She said nothing. I picked it up the morning after the signing, he said. I don't know why I'm telling you that. Because you want me to know you knew immediately that it was wrong, she said. And you want me to decide whether that means something. Does it? She looked at him for a long time, the kind of looking that has nothing performed in it, that is purely assessment. A woman who has spent 9 years reading a man trying to determine what she is actually seeing versus what she wants or fears to see. Ask me again in 6 months, she said. It was not the answer he wanted. It was the only honest answer available, and she knew that he knew that, and the knowing sat between them without needing to be named. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Greta Maris. He answered. The dawn will meet, Greta said. Tomorrow. Neutral location, his choice. He wants the full documentation, and he wants Ferrante's representation in the room. He'll have it, Cassian said. Mr. Vescari. A pause. He also asked me to tell you that the incident 3 years ago in the Bronx, the one your wife mentioned, he said he'd always wondered how that resolved without anyone firing a shot. Another pause. He said to tell her he owes her a conversation. Cassian looked at Serena across the table. I'll pass that along. He put the phone in his pocket. Castellano will meet tomorrow. She nodded once. He paid for breakfast. They went back to the Murray Street building to collect the documents Greta Maris had prepared, and from there to a car that took them to Ferrante's Westchester compound, where the old Don was waiting in a sitting room that smelled like old wood, and the particular calm of a house that has survived several generations of people trying to destroy it. Ferrante had aged overnight in a way that was visible and unsentimental. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at both of them when they came in, and for a moment he said nothing at all, which was his way of letting the room find its own weight before he added to it. Lucien spoke for 4 hours this morning, Ferrante said. His full cooperation, names, accounts, communications. The Moretti connection goes deeper than the Boston operation. There's a financial arrangement with a real estate holding company in Miami that connects to 3 legitimate businesses the Moretti family has been using to launder proceeds from 5 different families' operations. He looked at Cassian. Including yours. I'll need everything. You'll have it. Ferrante looked at his hands. Lucien is many things. He is not, it turns out, willing to go to the end of the road for the Moretti organization. He is willing to go quite far for his own survival. What happens to him? Serena said. Ferrante looked at her with the particular regard he'd been giving her since the Meridian Hotel, the regard of a man who had spent 40 years in a world that undervalued certain kinds of intelligence and had the particular sorrow of recognizing that fact too late to do much about it. That conversation involves all 5 families. It's not mine alone to decide. He paused. But my recommendation will be exile, full removal from all operations, all territories, all contact with any family member or associate. He lives, but he does not participate. He exists in a way that serves as a reminder without becoming a martyrdom. Cassian said nothing. He was thinking about 15 years, about the chair across from his desk, about the cup of coffee Lucien never finished, which had always seemed like a quirk and now seemed like something else, the gesture of a man who is present in a room without ever fully committing to being in it. I'll support that recommendation, Cassian said. Ferrante nodded. They spent 3 hours in the compound, going through the full audit with Ferrante's legal team, coordinating the documentation for the Castellano meeting, working through the financial untangling that would be required to separate the Moretti laundering operation from the legitimate structures it had embedded itself in. It was detailed and procedural and exhausting, the kind of work that had no drama in it but was the actual substance of everything, the grinding reality beneath all the things that happened in the dark by the water. Serena led most of it. She sat at Ferrante's table with the documents and the timeline and the financial mapping, and she worked through it with the Old Dawn's legal team with the focused, unhurried precision of someone who had been doing this for years in rooms that no one knew she was in. Cassian watched her and contributed when he was needed and stayed out of the way when he wasn't, which was harder than it sounded and which he managed with imperfect but genuine effort. Ferrante watched him watching her once from across the room. The old man's expression was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a man who has waited a long time for something to become visible to someone else and has the complicated satisfaction of watching it finally happen. At 4 p.m, they were done with what could be done in one day. Ferrante walked them to the car himself, which he did not do for most people. He stood on the steps of the compound in the thin November light with his hands in the pockets of his cardigan and looked at both of them. "The Castellano meeting tomorrow," he said to Serena. "I want you in that room." "I'll be there," she said. "And the full gathering, all 5 families, when we reconvene the agreement. I want you at the table." He said it simply, without preamble, the way significant things are best said. Not behind someone, not managing from the periphery, at the table. Serena looked at him. Something moved across her face, not surprise, but the specific quality of a person receiving something they had stopped expecting to be offered. "All right," she said. Ferrante looked at Cassian, a long look, the kind between men who do not need to say everything out loud and have learned, over years, that the things said out loud are usually the less important ones. "Take care of that cut," Ferrante said. He went back inside. The car took them across the bridge into the city as the light failed, the skyline coming up against a sky that was doing something complicated with cloud and color, the kind of sky that the city occasionally produced as if to remind people that it was capable of beauty when it chose to be. Cassian looked at it through the window. Serena sat beside him with her hands in her lap and the bare left hand visible. "The Sunset Park apartment," he said. "Is the lease month to month?" "Yes." "How long have you had it?" 3 years. He absorbed this. "What else don't I know about?" She looked at him. "Do you want a list?" "I want to know what I should know." "Those aren't the same question." He thought about that. "No," he said. "They're not." He looked back out the window. "Tell me what I should know." She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet there was something happening, a calculation, but not the cold kind, the kind that weighs what it costs to be honest against what it costs to stay protected, and finds slowly that the protection has been more expensive than the honesty would have been. "There's a man in Philadelphia named Greaves," she said. "He's been running a secondary intelligence operation that reports to me. Not to you, not to Lucien, to me. He has files on every senior member of all 5 families going back 8 years. I started it as a precaution." She looked at her hands. "I kept it as insurance." "Against what?" "Against exactly what happened 4 days ago," she said. "Against the situation where I needed proof and had no official standing to gather it." She paused. "I was going to tell you about it." I kept moving the timeline. He nodded. "There's also a property in Queens," she said, "and a set of accounts in the Cayman Islands that are not part of the Vescari operating structure. They're mine, not taken from you. Built separately over time through commissions on the truces I negotiated." She looked at him directly now. "I want you to know they exist, and I want you to know I'm not going to tell you how much is in them." He looked at her. "Because that's mine," she said. "That's the thing I built that has nothing to do with you or the organization or any obligation to anyone. And if this—" She paused, and the pause contained the gesture of the space between them and everything it held. "Doesn't work. If we try to rebuild this and it turns out we can't, I needed to know I had something that was only mine." The car moved through traffic. A light turned red and they sat in it. "That's fair," he said. She looked at him. He met the look. "That's fair," he said again, because it needed to be said twice. The light changed. They drove. He had the driver drop her at the Sunset Park apartment because she asked to be dropped there, and he understood that she needed the apartment to still be hers, needed the night there, the sleep in a space that was not the Vescari estate, the morning in a kitchen that was Clara Soto's kitchen, and therefore not anyone's claim on her. He understood this not because she explained it, but because he was finally paying the kind of attention that might have prevented everything if he'd been paying it 6 days ago. He went back to the estate alone. It was strange in the way that familiar places become strange when you see them after something irreversible has happened in them. He walked through the front hall and the study and stood at his desk and opened the drawer and looked at the ring for the 4th time in 4 days. He picked it up. He turned it in his hand. The flat face of the emerald caught the desk lamp and held the light in the way flat stones hold light, not reflecting it back cleanly, but absorbing most of it and giving back something darker and less brilliant, something that was the light transformed rather than the light returned. He put it in his breast pocket. He didn't sleep. He worked through what could be worked through at night and let the rest wait for morning, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, in the space between tasks, he thought about the highway in February 12 years ago, and he thought about it with a completeness he had never been able to bring to it before because he hadn't known what he was thinking about. A woman he'd known for less than a year had found out he was going to be killed, and had gotten in a vehicle and put it between him and the people who were coming for him, and had never said a word about it. Had driven away. Had shown up for dinner 2 nights later and sat across from him and talked about something he couldn't remember now, and looked at him the way she looked at him, which was the way she had always looked at him, which was the look he had stood in front of for 9 years, like standing in front of a window without ever thinking to look at what it faced. He sat with that for a long time. In the morning, he called Breck and reinstated the full security detail. He called Ferris and spent an hour on the financial reconstruction. He called Rourke and thanked him, which was not something he did often, and Rourke received the thanks in his usual silence, which was how Rourke received most things. He called Orsini and had a conversation that was short and specific and ended with a probationary arrangement that neither of them discussed in terms of forgiveness, because forgiveness was not the operating currency between them and never would be. He called the Greaves contact in Philadelphia and introduced himself, and the conversation was brief and correct, and at the end of it he said, "Your arrangement with my wife stands. I want that clear." And the man on the other end said, "Yes, sir," and he ended the call. At 8:30, he drove to Sunset Park. He parked in front of the dry cleaning shop and sat in the car for a moment. The shop was open. A woman behind the counter was processing something in a large machine, and the window was slightly fogged. Ordinary morning, ordinary block. He went upstairs and knocked. Serena opened the door in a dark sweater and bare feet with coffee in her hand and sleep still visible in her face, the particular unguarded quality of someone who has not yet fully assembled themselves for the day. And she looked at him with an expression that was not entirely happy to see him, but was not entirely not. "The Castellano meeting isn't until 2, she said. "I know." She looked at him. He reached into his breast pocket and held out the ring. She looked at it in his hand. Not at him. At the ring, the flat emerald and the oxidized silver, his grandmother's piece, the thing that had sat between them for 4 days across drawers and distances, and the irreversible architecture of what he'd done. She didn't take it. "I told you," she said. "Ask me again in 6 months." "I'm not asking you to put it on," he said. "I'm asking you to hold on to it, because it belongs with you and not in my desk drawer, and I'm not ready to put it anywhere else." She looked at him. He waited. She took it. She didn't put it on. She closed her hand around it and held it and looked at him with the look she'd been giving him for 9 years, which he was finally, at extraordinary cost, beginning to understand how to look back at, without flinching. "Come in," she said. "I'll make more coffee." He came in. The apartment was small and clean and smelled like the dry cleaning chemicals from below, and the coffee she was making, and the particular lived-in quality of a space that someone had arranged not to impress anyone, but to be functional and quiet and theirs. There were no photographs. There was one plant, which was not thriving, but was surviving, which seemed about right. There was a table with 2 chairs, and she put coffee in front of him and sat across from him and set the ring on the table between them, where both of them could see it. They sat like that for a while. The coffee was good. Outside, the city moved through its morning with the total indifference of large things to the small, specific griefs and recoveries happening constantly inside them. The Castellano meeting was at 2. The full family gathering to reconvene the agreement was scheduled for Thursday. The acetone network would take 4 months. The Luxembourg accounts were thawing. Lucien Drey was in a room in Westchester answering questions with the focused cooperation of a man who has done his calculation and committed to the result. And Aldo Ferrante, 71 years old, who had buried 2 sons and 1 nephew and had watched this city try to destroy itself with an efficiency that had never stopped surprising him, was at his compound in Westchester that morning reviewing the documentation for Thursday's gathering. And at some point he set the papers down and looked out the window at his grounds in the November light and thought about the moment in the Meridian Hotel ballroom when Serena Vale had walked toward the exit with 2 of Cassian's men and had looked back at him, and the look she had given him and what he had understood in that look. Not defiance, not injury, something beyond both of those. The look of a woman who knew with complete and patient certainty that the thing that had just been done to her was not the end of anything, that it was, in fact, the beginning. He thought about Thursday, about the table they would sit around, all 5 families, for the second time in a week and a half, about the chair at the center that had been his suggestion and that no one had contested, because everyone in that room had spent the past 4 days understanding something they had perhaps always known at the level below knowing, the level where the body keeps score before the mind has the language for it. The most capable person in any room is not always the one who commands it. Sometimes it is the one who holds it together in the spaces between the commanding, in the margins where the real architecture lives, in the patient and invisible work of keeping people from destroying each other long enough for them to remember why it's worth it not to. Ferrante picked the papers back up. Thursday was coming, and for the first time in a very long time, he found himself looking forward to what happened next. The Castellano meeting happened in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown that had no visible connection to any family and had been chosen by the Don himself, which meant it had been chosen carefully. The Don's name was Victor Castellano, 66 years old, who had inherited the family from his father at 32 and had spent the 3 decades since performing the difficult act of being both legitimate and not. A man who kept a law firm on retainer and a separate set of books in a location the law firm did not know about. He was already seated when Cassian and Serena arrived. Ferrante's representative, Sal, was at the far end of the table. Greta Maris sat to the side with a legal pad and the expression of someone who intended to be useful without being central. Victor Castellano looked at Serena when she came in, not at Cassian, at Serena. "The Bronx situation," he said. No greeting, no preamble. "3 years ago, that was you." "Yes," she said. "My son was going to be in that building." "I know." Victor was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, then back at her. "I pulled my family from the agreement because I was told the Vescari operation was compromised at the structural level, that the instability was internal and unresolvable." He placed one hand flat on the table. "I was told this by a source I trusted." "Lucien Dre," Cassian said. "Through 2 intermediaries, which is how I know it was deliberate." Lucien understood that a direct approach would be questioned. He was patient about it. Victor looked at the documentation Serena placed in front of him, the full audit, the Moretti financial connection, the fabricated call logs. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. "My counsel has reviewed the preliminary materials Greta sent last night." "And?" Sal said. Victor looked at Cassian. "You humiliated your wife in front of 500 people based on evidence a man in your own house manufactured specifically to make you do exactly that." He said it without cruelty, the way a doctor names a condition. "That is the structural problem, not the accounts, not the shipments. Those are recoverable." He paused. "The question is whether the judgment problem is recoverable." The room was quiet. Cassian did not look at Serena. He looked at Victor Castellano and he said, "I don't have an argument against that assessment." "I'm not asking for an argument," Victor said. "I'm asking what's different now." Cassian thought about it. The honest version, not the version that served him. "Nothing is structurally different," he said. "I made a decision in a bad moment based on bad information, and it was the worst decision I've made in 15 years. I can tell you it won't happen again, but that's what every man says after the catastrophic version of a thing he's probably done in smaller ways his entire career." He stopped. "What I can tell you is that the person who understood the situation correctly, who identified the problem, who built the proof, and who spent 4 days constructing the architecture for this conversation while I was catching up, is sitting next to me. And going forward, she's at the table, not managing from behind it." Victor looked at Serena. "Is that your understanding?" he said. "It's what was offered," she said. "I'm still deciding what I want." Something moved across Victor Castellano's face. It was not quite a smile, but it occupied the same territory. He looked at Sal, then at Greta Maris, then back at Serena. "The Castellano family will return to the agreement," he said, "with one amendment. The peace accord requires a designated liaison from each family responsible for interfamily communication, a role that existed informally before." He looked at Serena. "I want it formalized. I want it to have standing." "All 5 families would need to agree," Sal said. "They'll agree," Victor said. He said it the way men say things they already know the answer to. The meeting ended at 4:15. They rode the elevator down in silence, Cassian and Serena, and stood on the sidewalk in the cold while Sal flagged the car. "A formalized role," Cassian said. "I heard him. Is that what you want?" She looked at the street. The city doing its late afternoon thing. People moving fast, collars up, the particular urgency of a place that does not slow down for anyone's internal weather. "I don't know yet what I want," she said. "I know what I'm good at. Those aren't always the same thing." The car came. Thursday arrived the way consequential days arrive, indistinguishable from ordinary ones until you're inside them. The 5 families gathered in a building in Lower Manhattan, a space that had been used once before, 3 weeks ago, when the chandeliers were burning and the Barolo was open and the world had appeared briefly to be moving in a direction that made sense. The chandeliers were burning again. The 5 tables had been arranged the same way. The pentagon, the round table at the center. But the round table had 6 chairs now instead of 5, and everyone who entered the room saw the 6th chair and understood what it meant before anyone said anything about it. Ferrante arrived last, as the senior patriarch, which was his right and his habit. He walked to his table and stood, and looked at the 6th chair, and then looked at the room. "We have a correction to make," he said, "to the structure of what we built 3 weeks ago, not to the agreement itself, to the table it sits on." He looked at Serena, who was standing near the eastern wall, in the same position she had occupied at the first signing, visible, close, not at a table. The accord requires someone whose function is the health of the accord itself. Someone whose obligation is not to any single family, but to the agreement between all of them. That position has existed informally for 6 years, he paused. It should have been formalized 6 years ago. No one spoke against it. No one questioned the sixth chair. Serena walked to the round table and sat down. She sat with her hands folded in front of her, and her back straight, and her face carrying the expression she carried in every room. Complete attention, no performance. And she looked around the table at the 5 men who had spent their careers building power out of fear and violence and the particular human hunger for dominance, and who were sitting here tonight because of her, because of 6 years of invisible work and one terrible week that had made the invisible visible. The ring was on her finger. She had put it on that morning quietly in the Sunset Park apartment without announcing it. Cassian had seen it and had said nothing, and she had not explained it because it was not the restoration of something. It was the beginning of something different, which did not need explanation so much as time. Cassian, at the Vescari table, watched her at the center of the room. He had built an empire. He had built it on force and intelligence and the specific brutal efficiency of a man who understood power as something you took and held. He had built it over 15 years and had nearly destroyed it in one night, and what had saved it was not his strength or his reputation or the infrastructure of the organization he'd constructed. What had saved it was the woman at the center of the table. He understood that now, without qualification, without the softening instinct that makes men reframe what they owe into something more comfortable. He owed her the empire. He owed her his life, twice over. Once on a highway in February, and once in a week that had taken everything apart and put it back together in a configuration that was more honest than the original. He did not know if she would stay. She had not told him she would stay. She had said, "Ask me in 6 months," and 6 months was a long time, and he had done enough damage that 6 months of repair might not be sufficient. He was going to find out. Ferrante called the room to order. The second signing took 20 minutes. When it was done, Ferrante opened the Barolo, the same label, a different bottle, and poured 6 glasses this time instead of 5, and the 6th glass went to Serena, and every person in the room raised theirs. No one made a speech. The most important things rarely require one. Outside, the city moved through its night with its customary indifference to the specific human negotiations happening inside it, and the chandeliers burned, and the wine was the same wine it had always been. And at the center of the table sat the woman who had held everything together until the moment it broke, and then had held it together through the breaking. And that was the truth of it. Plain, unadorned, and finally, in this room, acknowledged. It was enough. For now it was enough.